And not too long after this is when we hear the announcement. And this is the thing we've been leading to the entire show. Chris is going to be in a 4-man tournament to crown the first undisputed champion at the Vengeance pay-per-view. So the concept, as you recall, is when WCW comes in, they're bringing in their world champion, Booker T. So we've got 2 world titles sort of floating around here. But now that the invasion is effectively done at the end of Survivor Series, we don't need 2 world titles. Let's have 1 undisputed champion. And the 4 guys, of course, are going to be The Rock, Steve Austin, Kurt Angle, and Chris Jericho. We should remind you, Triple H is on the shelf and hurt at this point. So was Chris Benoit. Bruce, was anybody else considered to be in this 4-man tournament or why? I mean, obviously we understand Austin and Rock, no questions asked. What's the thought process with adding Benoit and Angle here? If, and was anybody else considered?
Well, I think that when we got to this point, it was the point of, all right, I think it's a little confusing with the 2 different world championships, if you will, and the need and desire to get to 1 championship. That was really the intent. But again, had we had healthy Triple H and had a few more players, that I don't know that things wouldn't have been a little bit different at that time. So it was looking at really shaking things up and utilizing the talent that we had, but also trying to be as unpredictable as we possibly could as well.
Let me ask, and this is a weird question to ask, but let's pretend for a minute, hypothetically, Triple H does not tear his quad. Let's pretend hypothetically, Chris Benoit does not need neck surgery. Is it still these same 4 guys? Or if you have Benoit and Triple H, does this tournament look a little different?
I think it would look a whole lot different if we had all those guys that were healthy and able to go.
Would you have started with 8 men, or would you have used 4? And if it's 4, would Triple H have been in this spot and maybe Jericho not?
I don't know that we would have even been in the spot of unifying the championships at that point. There's so many ifs to that one's hard to answer, because the whole summer, the whole everything would have been different.
Well, so the idea being, if we have all those performers, maybe we can justify having 2 world titles, but with this sort of shallow pool at the top, maybe we only can support 1.
Yeah. And maybe we wouldn't have had the invasion be the way that it was. So there were a lot of outside obstacles that would have made all of that look a whole lot different.
Gotcha. Well, let's get to the show. This is why we're here. The Vengeance pay-per-view. On the way here, I guess we should mention that, the December 3rd Raw, we saw Austin pin Chris with a stunner, and a few days later on SmackDown, Rock and Austin would team up to beat Jericho and Angle. Rock uses a sharpshooter on Jericho, and that's your finish. And after the match, Angle would give Chris an angle slam. So everybody's piling on poor Chris Jericho, but don't cry for him. He's going to win the WCW world title, pinning The Rock in 19 minutes and 5 seconds. Huge win, biggest night of his career. It's a 4-star match. Vince is going to be involved here. There's a distracted referee, lots of shenanigans. But Jericho hits a low blow and pins The Rock with his own rock bottom finisher. How about that?
There you go.
Right after that match, wouldn't you know it, Jericho's going to win the WWF world title from Steve Austin and combine both belts, easy for me to say, in 12 minutes and 33 seconds, 3.25 stars. Again, some more interference, another ref bump, Jericho doing a low blow and a mistimed stunner. Austin's going down late. Vince comes out with Nick Patrick, but before he can make the count, Flair comes out and decks Nick Patrick, and Vince punches Flair and posts him and takes him out. And then Austin uses a low blow and a Boston Crab. Of course, Jericho's tapping like crazy, but there's no referee to see it. Booker T runs out of the crowd, hits Austin with one of the belts. And while Vince throws Hebner in the ring to make the count, there's your finish, 3.25 stars. And Meltzer would say that the finish live was flat. And I got to say, of the 2 matches, did think the Rock match was better than the Austin match. What'd you think of the creative with all these moving parts in the last match with Austin?
A lot of gaga, as Pat Patterson would say. It was a lot of gaga to get where we wanted to go, and I think it was in the vein of trying to protect everybody and give a finish that nobody saw coming, with Jericho winning, because nobody called that. I don't think that anybody would have thought that, okay, this is the opportunity to put Chris Jericho over. And when we got there, I think the finish and everything about it, the story was a shock to the audience, because just wasn't I don't think it was what anybody expected. So I thought it worked in that regard, and we got to tell the story we wanted to tell, and shock people a little bit with Chris.
Was any pushback from Austin or Rock about putting Chris over in the creative here?
Oh God, not at all. I think that everybody was on board and felt that it was the right thing to do for all the reasons that I just laid out.
So no pushback from creative, the boys, nobody. Everybody's on board with this one.
Yeah, and they felt that Chris pretty much was like, all right, yeah, if you're going to do it, let's do it.
Chris is
told. I think the guys like Chris enough, and he had proven himself that it was a new face in that mix.
I'm always fascinated, sort of hear how the boys find out about these big moments, because even though, I'm sure a lot of old jaded wrestlers are like, it's a fucking prop. It's just something heavy to carry around in your bag, blah, 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 all that shit. On some level, everybody dreamed about the moment they would be world champion for the first time, or the top guy in the business. Maybe you don't care about the belt or the prop. Okay, whatever. But everybody in every profession wants to be at the top of the mountain, and being, the world champion of the WWE means you are the top guy in the profession. I mean, that's just the way that has been for a very long, long time. And maybe there was no better sort of anointing of a guy than beating the two top stars at that point in the business. But years later, you might argue two of the top stars in the history of the business, Rock and Austin, on the same night. So you would think, maybe somebody sits him down, because we've all heard about this, and guys would say years later when it didn't happen, I was told I would be champion. And you would correct that and say, no, what Vince really said was, I could see you as champion, not we're going to make you champion on such and such day at so-and-so building. But Chris tells a story that he doesn't even know this is going to happen until the day of the show. He's at catering with the Undertaker, and Vince comes up and says, hey, Taker, you know how the business is going down the toilet? Because we're putting the belt on Jericho. And that's the way Jericho found out he was going to be champion. I mean, that's probably not how most people would imagine that goes down, but that's what makes wrestling so fun and interesting, isn't it?
Exactly. And, I'm sure Chris had somewhat of a heads up, but sometimes, guys don't know till they get there. Hey, congratulations. Bret Hart didn't know until he arrived at the building that day, the first time that he won the championship. So it just depends in timing and what have you.
Jericho says when he came back through the curtain that night, everyone was gone, because when you're on last, everybody wants to leave to beat the traffic. And he sat there by himself and then drove himself to the hotel, and room service had stopped. So he ordered a pizza, but they wouldn't bring it to his room. So he had to go down in the lobby to get it. When he goes back up to the room to enjoy his pizza, he's locked out. So he has to go back down to the lobby, but the guy wouldn't give him a key because he didn't have his ID, even though he had just seen him check in a few minutes earlier. So he finally drops the pizza on the floor out of frustration, and the guy let him in. So he spent the night, his first night as undisputed champion, eating cold, fuzzy pizza at a Ramada Inn somewhere in Anaheim, California. So there you go. And the next night on Raw, the show opens with Ric Flair in the ring with both titles. He calls Chris down, presents him with both world titles. And during the promo, Rick tells Chris he's going to defend the titles that night in a cage against Austin. later in the show, of course, Jericho would beat Austin in the cage match in 11 minutes. And they did their best Kerry Flair finish where Booker does the Terry Gordy part and slams the cage door on Austin. And a few days later on SmackDown, Rob Van Dam and Rock would team up to beat Jericho and Undertaker when RVD pinned Jericho after the Van Daminator. And that essentially brings us to a close here. It's Chris's first 2 full years in the company, and what a crowning achievement to win not one world title, but both world titles from the 2 biggest stars. And as we know, we're on our way to march towards a WrestleMania main event, and Jericho's a made man after maybe a little rocky start.
Yeah, he was the first ever unified champion, and that was a huge deal. And I think that he deserved it, and it was something that got people talking. So Jericho, from, those first 2 years, was able to step up, say, look at me, make everybody take notice. And, again, deservedly so.